First, you'll want to go to scratch.mit.edu, log in, click on your username at the top right, and then click on My Stuff, and then click on the Cyber Spartans Project Studio, and last, open the project called Cyber Hygiene. Before logging onto the computer, we have to create the real-life version of our project. In this video, you will be learning how the code on Scratch will work. I'm going to show you how a small portion of the Cyber Hygiene project works in Scratch. I will show you how to make a digital footprint sprite get smaller and how to make a lock slider. First, we're going to show you how to make your digital footprint sprite get smaller as you complete a task. Our first step in creating the code is to create a sprite. A sprite is an object or a character in Scratch that performs actions in a project. The coding will control what the sprite does and how it looks. You can choose from the ones available from the library here, or you can upload your own by clicking here. First, we want to represent tasks being completed using a simple button sprite. This green button, named Task Button, is our sprite. I got this sprite by going into the library here and selecting button 1, which you can find right here. The code tab on the left shows all of the code available to use. You can drag and drop code into the workspace so that I can control your sprite. I want this button to represent tasks being completed. Whenever I click on the button, a variable that I named completed tasks should go up by 1. We can make this work in Scratch using our code blocks. I'll go to Events on the side here and select when this sprite is clicked. I can drag it to the workspace, and this tells us that any code underneath it will run after the current sprite is clicked, which is our button. I want a variable named completed tasks to go up by 1 whenever the sprite is clicked. I can create a variable called completed tasks by going into variables, selecting make a variable, and typing completed tasks, and selecting OK. Now we have a variable called completed tasks with the blue check mark next to it, and we have completed tasks on our project. I can drag change completed tasks by 1 onto the project, and it should fit together like a puzzle piece. Let's see how that works. When we click on the sprite, we can see the completed tasks variable going up by 1 each time. Perfect! Sprite number 2, our digital footprint sprite. The physical activity part of this code was represented on side 1 of your game board. We want our digital footprint sprite to get smaller as we complete 1, 2, and 3 tasks. I uploaded a sprite for my digital footprint from my computer, as you can see right here. All of these code blocks that just showed up can be found on the Code tab on the left. In the physical activity, you place the red arrow pointing to the digital footprint sprite. That was to identify that you would be controlling the coding of that sprite. Since I selected the digital footprint sprite like this, all of this code controls the digital footprint sprite. The green flag button shown here starts your Scratch project. You can start it and stop it anytime. When I click on the green flag, the digital footprint sprite starts out at size 75, as you can see right here, and it says your footprint is large because no tasks were completed yet. The code did this using the first 4 pieces here. The when flagged click piece makes it so that when this green flag is clicked, the first piece of code that runs is all of the code that comes after it. The first one that runs is set size to 75%, which sets the size of the footprint to 75 in the beginning. Switch costume to large makes it so that the message, your footprint is large, is displayed. This is because I made a costume in Scratch, and I named it large. Costumes are other appearances of your sprite. Don't worry too much about it now, but I made 3 different costumes by going into the Costumes tab next to the Code tab. This is what the large costume looks like. Going back, we want completed tasks to start off as 0 until tasks are completed, so I set completed tasks to 0, as shown here. That's what our project initially starts out as. But we want, whenever I complete a task by clicking on the button, that should represent one task being completed. Completed task goes up by 1, the footprint should get smaller to size 60, and say your footprint is getting smaller. The code does this using the wait until completed tasks equals 1 block that we created. The code is waiting for you to complete at least one task before doing something. The code underneath it, right here, is what will happen when you complete that one task. What I did was switch the costume to medium, which shows your footprint is getting smaller. It looks like this. This is the medium costume. I set the size to 60%, which made the footprint get smaller in size. I click the task again, completed task becomes 2, the footprint got smaller, and it still says your footprint is getting smaller. To make this work, instead I set completed task equals 2 in the wait until block. Then, underneath it, I set the size to 40%, which made the footprint get smaller. I click the task again, completed task becomes 3, and the footprint gets smaller, and now it says awesome job underneath it. It's a little hard to read, but that's what it should say. To make this work, this time I set completed tasks to 3 in the wait until block. I switched the costume to small, which looks like this. This is a small costume. And I set the size to 20, which is why it became so small. And it says 20 right here. That's how the digital footprint sprite works in Scratch. As a reminder, I will show you what it looked like in the Cyber Hygiene project. What we just made was a simpler version of that. The task here was represented by Dogmail, Snapcat, and Maps. As you complete a task, the footprint gets smaller. Let's try and see using the Snapcat task. Completed task is 0. Once I complete a task, it becomes 1. The footprint got smaller, and it says your footprint is getting smaller. Awesome. I'll show you how the lock slider works in Scratch. As a reminder, this is how the lock slider worked in our Cyber Hygiene project. We had an image of a phone and a slider down here. We clicked on the slider, and the slider moved to the right to show that we are unlocking the phone to access the home screen and apps. Going back to our project, I'm going to click on my lock slider sprite that I created. Remember that a sprite is an object that performs actions in a project. We usually need multiple sprites for our project. The coding will control what the sprites do and how it looks. The physical activity part of this code was represented on side 2 of your game board. I have created 2 costumes for my lock slider. Costumes are other appearances of your sprite. I made a costume by making sure my sprite was selected here and then going into the Costumes tab. The 2 costumes that I made one was the slider background, which is the longer portion of the slider, and just the slider. So first, when we click on the green flag at the top of our project, we want the slider background to show up on the screen at a specific location. The slider background is the longer portion of the lock slider. I did this in Scratch using the first 4 pieces of code here. When flag click makes it so that when this green flag is clicked, the first piece of code that runs is all of the other code that comes after it, which is this 3 right here. Go to x equals 0 and y equals 80 sets the location of the sprite. 0 and negative 80 is located where the lock slider is currently at. Switch costume to slider background makes the slider background appear on the screen. Slider background is the longer portion of the slider. Create clone of myself starts up something called a clone. We want to set the location of the slider costume as well, which is this portion right here. It looked like this. This is the part that moves on the lock slider. We want it to be in the front of the slider background and to the left. Since we just started a clone for the slider background, we will use when I start as a clone. Everything underneath it is the code that will run after the clone starts. Go to the front layer, go to x equals -30, y equals -80, and switch costume to slider blocks will cause the slider costume, which is the part that moves, to show up on the front of the background at this location, which is x equals -30 and -80, y equals -80, which is exactly what we want. But then we want the slider to move to the right when we click on it. This is how you do it in Scratch. The wait until touching mouse pointer and mouse down block is the signal for the slide to activate when the user clicks its mouse to slide the lock sprite. The glide 0.4 seconds to x equals 30 and y equals -80 blocks represents how far and long the slider sprite is activated and where it should go. 30 and -80 is located to the right of the slider background, so it'll move to the right and it'll move for 0.4 seconds. Let's see what it looks like. If I click on the slider, it'll go to the right. Perfect. You may have noticed that the lock slider also disappeared after it slided to the right. I did this in Scratch by adding this broadcast piece right here after the glide action piece. This basically sends out a message to our project. You can call the message anything you want by clicking New Message here, but I decided to call it Lock Slide. It's kind of like sending out a message to our project that says, hey, I just finished the lock slide. After the lock slide happens, we want the slider to disappear, so we put the hide piece underneath. We also want the slider background to disappear, so we created another block that says when I receive lock slide. Underneath it, I put hide so that the background will also disappear. Since we call hide on both the slider and the slider background, they both disappear. That's how the lock slider sprite works on Scratch. As a reminder again, I'll show you how it looked like in the Cyber Hygiene project. Ours was a simpler version of that. You just learned how to make a digital footprint sprite and lock slider sprite work in Scratch. Awesome job! Again, this is just an introduction to what you can do in Scratch, so don't worry if some things weren't clear. You will be learning a lot more about programming in Scratch throughout the entire program, and it will get more clear as you keep learning.